Today's message is entitled, The Cost of Calling. We're going to look at the cost that a minister sacrifices for the sake of the gospel. We're also going to look at the cost of the calling of the church and the sacrifices that they will make for the sake of the gospel. Paul's going to extend an invitation to each one of us to run our own individual races well and to run as if we are like one competing to win a prize. Really to be all in and to be committed, to make personal sacrifices for the sake of the gospel. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it's really like a to be continued from chapter 8. It's a continuation of Paul's sermon of personal sacrifice for the sake of others. And he's going to have a discussion here with the Corinthian church about ministers that receive payment for their ministry and ministers who willingly sacrifice to maybe fund their own ministry so they don't receive payment for a season or even for an entire career. And what Paul's going to tell us here is that a worker is worth their wages, but whether you pay a pastor to preach or not, everyone involved is going to be called to make personal sacrifices on behalf of the gospel. A great question that you might ask yourself is, what does it really take for me as a follower of Jesus to consider as a cost? What would it cost me in my life as a follower of Jesus for the sake of the gospel? And maybe we might look at it this way. What has God called me to sacrifice for the gospel in my unique situation? So whether we're in ministry full-time or pursuing a career in ministry, or maybe we're in the workforce and in the marketplace, what are the costs of doing what we do for the sake of the gospel? How could we count those costs and maybe even consider it to be a part of the purpose of our lives? You know, when I first got started in ministry, I was an associate student minister. That just meant that I was a glamorized intern. And at the time, the pastor of our church had resigned and the finances of the church had really kind of plummeted. And as a result, many of the ministers on staff were left to look for another job or were released from their position. And I remember running into my former pastor at Costco, and he smiled big and looked at me and he said, "Jared, do you still have a job at Hoffmantown Church?" And I told that pastor, "Well, Pastor, I hate to break it to you, I don't think I made enough hourly wage on the line item for the budget for them to even notice that I worked there. So yes, I still have a job there." And I laugh about how funny that was and probably was appropriately being paid for the work that I was offering at that day and age. I was very grateful for the experience I was getting. But I knew long term that I wanted to be married, I wanted to be a dad, and that I would have to provide for my family. Simultaneously, I felt God's calling on my life to be a minister, to be a full-time minister, to dedicate my entire life and career to the ministry. That would come with some cost. That would come with some sacrifices. And I was willing to make those sacrifices and continue to for the sake of the gospel. But I knew that the Lord had a path for me to be able to provide for my family, that they would not go hungry as a result. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament, we see these themes that God has put in place to provide ministers for the work of the ministry so that they can live. In verses 1 through 6 of chapter 9, Paul establishes his perspective from the authority of him being an apostle. This section deals with his apostolic authority. So he's going to speak to the Corinthian church from the apostolic authority that God had given him, and that they, as a church he started, were the proof of that authority. Let's take a look at this together, verses 1 through 6. Paul writes and he says these words. He asks, am I not free? Am I not apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you, because you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: don't we have the right to eat and drink? Don't we have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife like other apostles, the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? Let's look at this from verses 6 through verse 1 backwards. Paul essentially says, am I the only one? Is it just Barnabas and myself that are the only ones who can claim that right to not receive funds for our work of the ministry here in Corinth, for example? But are we the only ones to be able to refuse that right? And then he deals with, in verses 1 through 5, this series of questions and answers here. He has these questions that lead you to see and believe, hey, am I the only one who's seeing this? Like, I'm an apostle. Jesus revealed himself to me on the Damascus road. He sent me. He called me into the ministry. And that calling has been confirmed by the work of the ministry. In fact, you're my seal of that apostleship. You're the proof of the pudding here. I started this church in Corinth, and God has sent me out on this calling. He gave me this role. It's not a role that you gave to me. It's the role that God gave to me. But I am at work living out that calling. And in doing so, I look around and I see some ministers. I see some pastors that they serve. They use their gifting and their calling for the work of the ministry, and they are supplied for. They are financed to do that work. Paul is saying, that is okay. That is good. That is right. And rightfully so. And so Paul's claiming that apostolic authority here to remind the Corinthian church that they should really be listening in very closely. He does something similar. He writes to the church at Galatia, and he writes these words in Galatians chapter 1. He introduces himself, reminds them, Paul, an apostle that's not from men, and it's not by man, but it was by Jesus Christ. It was by Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And God, the Father, who saw fit to raise him up from the dead. That's the perspective that he's coming from here. Paul writes to them as that apostle called by God. Called by God to serve the Lord and to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And he saw fit to defend other ministers for receiving ministry funds. But he also saw fit to defend himself here in this regard for his position and his role as a minister who was known as a tent maker, who was known to be bivocational, or even in today's world, sometimes you could be a co-vocational worker, where you just set out not because you have to be bivocational, and so you work a job in the marketplace, but you also serve a local body and church. That's a bivocational role where it's kind of like a have to, but a co-vocational role that exists even today is, hey, I'm going out into the marketplace intentionally as a part of my strategy to go reach the world and plant a church. He defends these scenarios, but he also defends the scenario of one who's fully dedicated to the ministry and completely supported by the church. What Paul's doing here is he's not trying to elevate himself, but he's trying to remind the people of the authority that God's given him and the leadership that God's given them to help provide some order around this discussion. In verses 7 through 14, he's going to spend quite a bit of time explaining the right to be supported. Some people do not believe that ministers have the right to be supported. That's a very unfortunate perspective. And Paul's going to give 3 illustrations in just common society as to why it should be seen to be okay to support a minister, because we do it in these other areas as well. Let's look at the right to be supported here in verses 7 through 14. Paul says, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who shepherds a flock and does not drink the milk from the flock?" Am I saying this from a human perspective? Doesn't the law also say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, "Don't muzzle an ox while it treads out grain." Is God really concerned about oxen here? Isn't he really saying it for our sake? Yes, this is written for our sake, because he who plows ought to plow in hope, and he who threshes should thresh in hope of sharing the crop. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it too much to ask if we reap material benefits from you? If others have the right to receive benefits from you, don't we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. Instead, we endure everything so that we will not hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who perform the temple services, they eat from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the offerings of the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should earn their living by the gospel. That's really the heart of that section, verses 7 through 14. In the very same way that we pay others to do a job, we should consider paying our ministers to do a job for the sake of the gospel. And that is a calling, but it's also a job. Ministers should work to receive a wage. There's a key phrase in there. They need to work, right? It's the same expectation. Different types of jobs and job description, but the expectation is that they shouldn't just be paid to be lazy, but they should be paid to work. And their work is seen in the ministry, not in the results of how many are saved or how many come to church services, but the results are a reflection of God's outpouring of his Spirit, of what he is doing as they plant, as they water, and God's the one who brings and provides the growth. But the job of the minister in the expectation is to do the watering, to do that planting. There is a job description that they're called to do. And if they're called to do that job, they should be paid for their job. He gives 3 examples. He gives the example of military personnel, an example of really a shepherd or a farmer, if you will, and that kind of perspective of one who works in the vineyard. So this agricultural role, like a rancher farmer, I kind of see them simultaneous here, going side by side with each other on these 3 examples. Now, I did a little bit of research. I looked up those 3 jobs. Now, in the U.S., military can get their basic pay. That's their primary pay, and that's tax. The sacrifice on behalf of our country and the freedoms we get to enjoy. They get their basic pay, but they also get a basic allowance for housing known as a BAH, right? This is tax-free allowance that helps cover housing allowance, and with the amount varying depend on the location and the family status and so forth. But then there's a basic allowance for substance to be able to have a tax-free payment for food. They get special pay oftentimes for specific duties: flying, jumping out of an airplane, submarine duty, foreign language proficiencies, serving in intimate danger zones. There's bonuses that you might even receive for coming on as a new service member to be recruited into that. They get paid, and they get paid in a lot of ways, in a lot of creative ways, for the sacrifices they make for our country. Now, I looked up what a vineyard worker makes in Albuquerque, and the average vineyard manager makes about $69,000 to $70,000 a year in Albuquerque. That's someone who manages the working of a vineyard. Farmers, they're compensated in a variety of different ways, and so this is not true for every farmer for sure, but farmer compensation in America, while it varies, the median household total income is projected to increase in this year to $110,000 a year. And farmers live off of the land and their resources that are provided to them by the work that they do to work that land. You know, what we see here is this theme that's being developed in these verses 7 through 14 of chapter 9 here. And Paul writes about their rights, their right to support, their labor, and the reward for their labor. Now, what we see and what we know in society is that while there's averages, some get paid more and some get paid less. That's common and that's understandable, and that can be true for pastors as well, ministers as well. But what we gather here is essentially what is written in Luke chapter 10 verse 7, is that a worker should be paid for his wage. You know, the middle verse, part of this verse, for the worker is worthy of his wages. How is that done here at Anchor Church? How it's done is myself, my family, we're all participants in this as members of this church, as people who gravitate towards Anchor Church. We see it as a great joy, an act of worship to present our tithes and our offerings to the Lord here at Anchor. And so we give to the Lord through Anchor Church. And there are many others in this body, and some who do not participate in that, but many who do participate in that. They give to the Lord at Anchor Church as their act of worship. Now, Anchor Church collects those tithes and offerings. We have a delegation of duties and accounting where there are people who count the tithes, and there's deposit, and people who record those tithes on our ledger, our QuickBooks account. And there's people who, in fact, reconcile the account. And there's a board of directors, a board of trustees that have been assigned by the church that are held accountable to our state, local, and our national government to kind of provide financial oversight to the church. And so annually we write up a budget, and our board discusses that budget, and then we approve the budget. And that is how our ministers and ministry is funded here at Anchor Church. And so Paul's writing to the church at Corinth, and they didn't have that type of accounting procedure put in place, I'm sure, for this early church and the requirements from the government. And it looked different then. But what we see is what we find in Luke chapter 10. We see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. A wage that can be given to a pastor should not be withheld, that you should pay a pastor what he is worth. A farmer, they plant those crops and they reap a harvest. A vineyard that is planted, you're going to reap the harvest. The work of the minister, they should be able to reap a harvest as well for their work. Verses 15 through 18 kind of take a shift here, though. Paul does something. He talks about his radical choice to give up his own personal rights to payment as a minister. He says, "For my part, I have used none of these rights, nor have I written these things, that they may be applied in my case. For it would be better for me to die than for anyone to deprive me of his boast." Paul's writing here and he's saying, it would be better for me to die than for anyone to deprive me of my own boast here, saying, this is my choice. Don't take this away from me. For if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast, because I am compelled to preach, and woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Paul's talking about calling here. He's talking about his rights. He's talking about a higher calling. This is not just a job to him. Verse 17 says, "For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if I do it unwillingly, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? My reward is simply this: to preach the gospel and to offer it free of charge and not make full use of my rights in the gospel." What we see in this section is Paul's giving us a theme here. A theme of voluntary sacrifice and reward. Not working under compulsion, but working out of the joy of his calling. And Paul, he didn't want anyone to accuse him. He didn't want anyone to deprive him of his right to be able to do that calling. And so he made that voluntary choice to sacrifice. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 7 through 9, Paul kind of sheds more light to this, and I'm so sorry for the pop. We've been working very hard to eliminate that today, but in this recording, we've been unable to do so. We've recorded about 4 times already today. But here's what Paul says in verses 7 through 9. "Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I took from other churches. I robbed from other churches by taking payment from them to end up ministering to you. When I was present with you in need, I did not burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. I've kept myself and will keep myself from burdening you in any way." Paul is saying, I'm going to sacrifice my right here from you, church at Corinth, and I'm going to receive funds from outside sources to be supplied to me to, in fact, even minister to you. And he's explaining that there can become this beautiful moment between you and the Lord to find great joy in sacrificing something that you see as your right to in order to fund ministry, to serve without getting any expectation, even in return. You know, we have a policy on our website about weddings, and I had to put that out on the website because when we first started the church, my perspective was, hey, a wedding is a ministry, and it's a part of the job. And so the church pays me to do this job. And so word had kind of gotten out that I was the free pastor for weddings, and I was getting inundated with requests to do weddings. And so while the wedding was free, I put a policy up, and I had some requirements. And those requirements were the 6 weeks of premarital counseling, typically, that I would do with a couple. And there was a payment for that to be issued because there's a lot of time invested and commitment there. And I had to put that up on the website because the word had gotten out that I was just the free wedding pastor. And man, many people in the city were requesting me to do weddings, and I had to say no to some. And so we put that policy in place, and that kind of filtered out requests that were what I would consider just unnecessary requests that were not meant for me to do as the pastor of Anchor Church. And here at Anchor, we do these weddings and funerals. We do them for free, gladly. And those weddings and funerals are part of the ministry here. And at times, I've received a gift, an honorarium, where people say, well, what do we pay you? And I say, you don't have to pay me anything. If you want to pay me a gift card, you're welcome to do so, as an honorarium or something like that, or a gift of some kind, and I'll take my family out for the time that was sacrificed here. But what Paul's writing about here is that, man, sometimes you can just do something out of the joy of your heart. And I can attest that these weddings, as I drive by wedding venues and locations, and I see couples at our church and in our city, and I go, thank you, Lord, that you allowed me the opportunity to be in their lives in that manner, in that role, to perform that act of service on behalf of the gospel. There's great joy in doing ministry. And sometimes love compels us. The love that we have for the Lord and for the gospel compels us to sacrifice our own rights. You know, I've heard of musicians at times that put on a benefit concert, that anything collected they do, and they give to that nonprofit or on behalf of that need. There could be great joy from sacrificing for the gospel. Consider that in your own life. You know, what rights are you claiming that you might be called to at a season or a moment to be able to sacrifice for the sake of the gospel? And Paul says he does this because in verses 19 through 23, he's going to shift and show us here his strategy and why he's willing to do that. It's because he wants to, in fact, become all things to all people so that some might be saved. In verses 19 through 23, he says, I'm willing to become all things to all people. That's point number 4 for you today. What are you willing to become on behalf of others? To become all things for all people. Paul's going to tell us here in this section in verses 19 through 23, point number 4, to become all things for all people. Let's see what that looks like. Verse 19, although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I had made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews, so that those under the law, like no one under the law, though I myself, I'm no longer under the law, to win those who feel as if they are under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ now, to win those without the law. Verse 22, he says, to the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I become all things to all people, so that I may, by every possible means, save some. Now, I do all of this because of the gospel, so that I might share in the blessings. Paul's themes of servanthood and sacrifice and adaptability ring throughout this section. Why? For the sake of evangelism. He had just got done talking about issues like circumcision and food sacrificed to idols. And so Paul's essentially saying, hey, to those who are Jews, I'm not going to assert my rights to eat pork in front of them and have a little barbecue with some delicious pulled pork and some sweet seasoning from my favorite restaurant. No, I'm going to sacrifice that so that I don't be a stumbling block. I don't become a stumbling block to those Jews, so that they might hear the message of hope that's found in Jesus Christ, that Jesus fulfilled the law for them. And to those who are not compelled to follow that law and follow those dietary laws or to follow the law of circumcision, to the Gentiles, to those who are not Jewish, I'm not going to mandate them to do that in order for them to then hear the gospel next. No, I'm coming with the full force of the gospel because the law has been fulfilled by Jesus. And so I'm not going to put that extra weight on the Gentile, the burden of the law, when they have the opportunity to receive Christ and have the fulfillment of the law through Christ. So he says, I'm not going to change my doctrine, but I'm going to change my methods. I'm not going to change my theology, but I am going to be adaptable to the scenario here that I'm being placed in. My ministry is going to have a different approach depending on who I am trying to reach and minister to. I'm going to come to them with what they need for the sake of the gospel. We've seen this written in the book of Philippians chapter 2. We've shared this before, but verses 5 through 7, remember that call to adapt the same attitude. We adopt it and we adapt to the scenario. We adopt the attitude of Christ and we adapt to the scenario. That those who follow Jesus, they would follow his example. Where Christ, he existed in the form of God. He did not consider that kind of equality with God to be something to be exploited here on earth. No, instead, he emptied himself He took on the role of a servant, the one who should have been worshiped, who should have been followed as king here on earth, was fulfilling a higher calling. He took on the likeness of humanity, and he came as a man. Yes, that humble role, fully God coming down as a man to humble himself and serve the world so that he could be the perfect sacrifice for mankind, the sinless sacrifice, to represent the payment and punishment of death and sin being poured out upon him for our sake. He represented that to all of us. He was our representation so that we could be saved. That's the kind of humility Jesus displayed. And so we too can have some humility in laying down some of our rights for the sake of the gospel. So I would invite you to be culturally flexible without compromising your faith. To understand and know the gospel is for all people. And let's be intentional about making it accessible for all people. Well, finally, in verses 24 through 27, our last point is to run this race with discipline. Run it with intentionality is what Paul's going to call us to. Run the race of humble sacrifice for the sake of others so that they might hear the gospel and find faith in Christ. Run that kind of race with intentionality and with discipline. Verses 24 through 27. Do you not know that the runners in a stadium all race, but only one receives the prize? So therefore, run in such a way to win the prize. Now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we live our spiritual faith out in the spiritual race that God's given us. We do it for an imperishable crown. So I do not run like one who runs aimlessly or box like one just beating the air. Instead, I discipline my body and I bring it under strict control so that after preaching to others, I will not be disqualified. Discipline, self-control, endurance, reward. That's what we see unfold in these verses. And Paul, he invites us to run our spiritual race like one with intentionality and discipline. Now, I work out, I lift weights, I exercise, but there's some things I'm not self-disciplined in. It would be probably a daily chocolate treat, a daily ice cream. I'm not willing to make those sacrifices to get myself in the most fit shape, but there are some Olympians that are willing to make those sacrifices. There's some high-level athletes that they train their bodies, they discipline their bodies. Not only have they been gifted athletically, but they follow a regimen to be able to maximize their ability in the games of life. Remember the Isthmus Games? They were taking place here in Corinth. In Athens, the Olympic Games were taking place. And so these two cities here, they were all about the sport. Athletics was very important to them. Competition was important. So they understood this illustration. And this illustration was meant to hit home the concept of, you know what? These athletes that we follow, they make some serious sacrifices to win the prize, to try and be victorious out on the Olympic-style sporting arena. And we need to live that way spiritually. We need to run our race that God has given us with a level of discipline and sacrifice. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, it says, "Therefore, since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily entangles us." Let's lay aside the things that trip us up, that delay us. And let us run with endurance this race that lies before us. And let us do so by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Friends, Paul writes, the book of Hebrews shows us that Our spiritual lives are like a race. How are you running that race? Are you running it with discipline, with sacrifice? Are you running it with an aim and a purpose and intentionality? Paul would say that the aim, the purpose, and the intentionality is to bring glory to God, to bring honor to God, to reach the lost. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it's not just about Paul and what he does, it's about us and what we are willing to do for the sake of the gospel. Paul gave up his rights, not out of a weakness, but he gave it up out of love. He becomes all things to all people, not to gain followers, to be a social media influencer, but to see souls saved. Paul ran with discipline, not just to compete, not just to kind of be around, to be in the race. No, he did it to win. He did it with intentionality. Friends, I might ask you to join in and consider how you could be in this race with a little more diligence, sacrifice, and service unto the Lord, with a more focused aim to see people saved and reach for the gospel, to see God's glory be brought to him by magnifying him with your life, by putting the spotlight on him with how you live. What are the sacrifices God's calling you to do for the sake of the gospel? Maybe one of those sacrifices was just enduring the popping on this message. Again, we are so sorry. We'll work hard to get that resolved. Thank you for listening today. Thank you for joining us in this time of worship. Let's continue on and praise our God.
I count on one thing, the same God that never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy all my days. Oh yes, I will. I count on one thing, the same God that never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. Is working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy all my days. Oh yes, I will for all my days. Oh yes, I will, and I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand against. And I choose to praise, to glorify the name of all names, that nothing can stand